Atheism, fig trees, and is it really just turtles all the way down? Today on Spirit Spire, Erik and I take a look at Lord Bertrand Russell's essay, Why I Am Not a Christian, starting right now. Broadcasting from the Cathedral of the Assumption in Louisville, Kentucky, this is Spirit Spire. And now, here is your host. Hello and welcome to Spirit Spire. I'm Isaac Fox, back today with my awesome co-host, Erik Huff.
Hello, Isaac.
Hello, Erik. How are you today?
Doing pretty good. Doing pretty good.
Good. I'm really excited about what we're going to be doing today. So one of the dogmatic truths of the Catholic faith is that the existence of God can be known through natural reason. We believe many things are revealed to us directly by God, but that the existence of God can be known through reason. And that brings us to the question of the whole topic of the conversation between atheism and theism.
Yes.
Does God exist, and can it be demonstrated that God exists?
Yes.
So what we're trying to do is start, hopefully will be an ongoing series of episodes looking into this question, examining some of the traditional arguments and contemporary arguments for the existence of God in great depth. I think we want to really dig into this. And of course, the arguments for atheism, and trying to be as fair and as complete as we can be. But I think what we've got planned today, before we get into those actual arguments, is going to be fun for hopefully for all of our viewers and listeners as well. So Erik, we were talking last night before the show today a little bit about what we would call the rise of the new atheism, which, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we can kind of date that from the early 2000s.
Yeah,
really.
For some reason, this might just be a number I'm making up, but 2003 really pops into my head as...
It sounds about right.
When at least, I don't know, I become aware of some of those materials and stuff when I look back.
I don't remember their names, but the couple that started the Bright movement, that was around 2002, and then right after that we start seeing what we call the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Samuel Harris, Daniel Dennett. We start seeing the rise of those guys.
This is the Four Horsemen.
The Four Horsemen, yes. And atheism has been around a lot longer than that. It's been with us for a great part of human history. But we have seen this really dramatic rise in what I would think of as the popularity of atheism in just the last couple of decades. And I guess there's probably many factors for that. But one of the things that I think is that those particular writers, especially Dawkins and Hitchens, had a lot of really popular appeal. If you go back to maybe the 1800s, and you look at a famous atheistic philosopher like Ludwig Feuerbach, it's dense. It's the kind of thing that might be read in universities and have an effect, but it's not the popular literature that everybody's going to have on their coffee table.
No.
Whereas Dawkins and Hitchens, and maybe Hitchens particularly, Hitchens was very witty, funny, clever, great turn of the phrase, and
endlessly entertaining to watch and listen to. Yeah,
very much so. And, I'm a theist myself, but I can give him props for that. I think he was a very compelling speaker and writer. I would certainly question the substance of his arguments, but nonetheless, there was a tremendous amount of popular appeal in these works. And I think there was things going on in our country and culture and society that also made those books even more appealing. And so it was kind of a phenomenon, this rise of the new atheism.
Yeah.
But what we were talking about last night is, I think you can go back about 100 years prior to that and find a very, very important name in the history of atheism that I would kind of view as the predecessor of the new atheists, because he had a lot of popular impact. He was witty, he was clever, he was all these things as well. And that, of course, is Lord Bertrand Russell.
Yes.
And in 1927, in Battersea in England, Russell delivered a lecture which later on became legendary, and that was entitled, Why I Am Not a Christian.
Which you have sitting right there.
We've got it sitting right here, Why I Am Not a Christian, by Bertrand Russell. And It had.
Can you say it like Bertrand Russell? In a Bertrand Russell voice?
I can do a British accent. I don't think I can get
Why I am not a Christian.
Yes, I don't think I can get the sort of elderly, intellectual, Cambridge.
He's so
Lord
classy,
Russell.
right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, he speaks. I mean, the name Lord Russell can apply directly to his voice. I mean,
Yes, it's the voice of Lord Russell.
Lord
It's like,
Russell,
that's
yes.
the Lord Russell sound.
That's exactly what I thought he would sound like. And it's also very cool. I mean, he was born in the 1870s?
Yeah.
So to even have in, modern memory, to have video recordings.
Yes.
And to
that's
hear
true.
someone from a previous era like that speak to us even now is a pretty spectacular thing. It's definitely like hearing a voice from another world too in that way.
Well, and famously, he engaged in a debate on the question of does God exist? And that's probably really the first recorded debate of that nature we have, isn't it? I would think. And that was with Father Copleston.
I would assume so, yeah.
Also a legendary debate.
Yeah, so, and also both men, I guess I was being a little bit funny with the voice for Russell, but to have them both recorded is they're both, very high class, gentlemen, very English.
Very.
Come from, very noble English families.
Very precise, very proper.
Yeah.
Very,
And so to hear.
They're very brilliant men, both of them.
And to be very, and so respectful and, you don't really hear something that classy. These days, if you were going to turn into a talk radio show or even to a podcast like ours, we're not classy at all. We're not nowhere near as elegant as these two men were, and to be able to hear it. So yeah, that debate is
it's a model of how of how both intelligent and charitable and respectful you should be in this conversation. They both men were models of good behavior.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is extremely spectacular, and Russell does this in Why I'm Not a Christian, as well as in the Copleston debate, is the defining of terms.
Yes.
So in today's world, when there's a debate, whether it be religious or political or metaphysical or whatever, it does seem that you see like a straw man argument.
Right.
Being presented. But at the beginning of the Copleston debate, they both agree on their terms, that what do they mean, and they both agree that they have the same definition.
Right.
So they're not speaking around each other. No one's missing the mark. They're talking about the same thing. And Why I'm Not a Christian, Russell starts off, he begins with explaining what a Christian is. And
I disagree with his explanation.
Do you?
I do.
I was going to say I think it's a pretty good explanation.
Part of it is, but I think there's a big gap, and maybe we can get to that in a moment. But no, I think that's right, and this is coming from an era where schoolmen of that sort were trained in debate. They were trained in rigorous approach to how you do research and scholarship, how you present your ideas, how you debate, and that defining of terms, that was kind of taken for granted that you would begin by defining your terms. And that's pretty critical.
Yeah, and I mean, in education at the time, you start with the grammar stage, you memorize a bunch of facts, you get to rhetoric, you go through logic and how to reason through these facts, and then you get to rhetoric, and you're in a much better position than today's education system gives you to be able to debate or dialogue on these things.
Well, so what we thought would be fun, because we feel like, Russell is certainly one of the kind of like the predecessors of the new atheism. And I don't want to be unfair, but I don't think this is too much of a stretch to say that a lot of the material for new atheism seems to really just be built right on Russell.
It's very similar
style,
ideas.
A lot of the actual approach, all of this I think is very similar. So,
and the fact that they also have that charm.
Yes.
That Russell had.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what we thought was, for our viewers and listeners today, and we'll see if we can get through all of it or part of it, but we want to actually walk through Bertrand Russell's speech or essay, Why I Am Not a Christian, and just do a nice examination of it and see underneath that charm, does it have the substance? Does it hold up, right? Is this a powerful argument about why one shouldn't be a Christian, or are we going to maybe think that there's some problems along the way? Before we get into that, though, you're our historian guy. Do you have any background stuff, anything interesting about Russell? Anything you want to throw out there before we dig into the essay?
Sure, yeah, that's good. I mean, Russell, you hear the term, is it 6 or 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon?
Yes, I think 7, isn't it?
7 degrees of Kevin Bacon, where...
Wait, did Russell know Kevin Bacon?
This is where we're about to get to, is, Kevin Bacon, I guess, is, the joke is that you're only like 3 people away from Kevin Bacon, or 7 degrees away from Kevin Bacon at any time, no matter who you are. With Bertrand Russell, I think he only had 1 degree to every historical figure. It seems like throughout his life, if he was alive during that time and even prior, he had some kind of relationship with, the great figures of the time, whether it be Ludwig Wittgenstein or near the end of his life, Sir Paul McCartney ended up moving into the same neighborhood. And they said, there's a philosopher, I'd heard this from an interview that Paul McCartney had given. Oh, there's some philosopher who lived down the street. So Paul McCartney just knocked on his door and would visit with him.
Wow, that's cool.
So yeah, Bertrand Russell, again, I really do appreciate people who, have community, the dialogue with others.
Yes.
It wasn't like he was just a debater or a great philosophical mind, even though he was those things. But as a person, he had great relationships like that. And it even goes back, he was raised by his grandfather.
Okay.
Who, I mean, if Russell was born in the 1870s, the grandfather must have been around the time of the French Revolution is when he would have been born. But he went and visited Napoleon on Elba personally.
Really?
Yeah, Russell's grandfather.
Wow.
And it was his grandfather who raised him. So, yeah, just fantastic.
A lot of history there.
It's crazy the amount of history that I think links back to Russell and through Russell's life. I mean, he did live for a very long time. And he was a prominent figure. Seeing that his grandfather was even a prominent figure. So it makes sense, but at the same time, I think that's part of his charm, at least for me.
And what's really kind of getting my curiosity going right now, you mentioned Paul McCartney, who was a well-known performer. Do you think maybe Paul McCartney would have met, Kevin Bacon at some point?
That's probably true.
Seems like there's a really good chance of it. So we might actually have the Kevin Bacon and...
We'll have to do the math on how far removed from Kevin Bacon Bertrand Russell is.
Exactly.
Yeah, probably not far, considering how many people he knew.
And I do kind of want to also throw this out, preparatory, if people don't know a lot about Bertrand Russell. Yes, we're looking at one of his essays about Christianity. We're thinking about him in terms of his atheism. But he was a lot more than that. And I don't know if we would even say that was his main thing. He was a very brilliant man. And he did incredible work in the field of logic.
Yes.
Right? He set the stage for a lot of the contemporary approach to logic. So he's very influential in philosophy and logic, completely apart from his religious worldview. Yeah, so very, very important figure there. Well, shall we dig in?
Yeah, I think that's great.
All right. So kind of a word on how this is laid out. As you mentioned, Erik, he begins by defining terms. So he indicates that it's important, if he's going to say why he's not a Christian, to say, what is a Christian?
Yeah.
And he goes with kind of a bare minimum approach here, which is fine. Because, by Russell's time, we don't just have the Catholic Church anymore. Right? We have the Anglican Church, in his case, in England. We have many different Protestant denominations. And they're all going to disagree on certain points of doctrine. So he wants to try to get down to the bare minimum. What is the bare minimum requirement of belief that you can have and say, I'm a Christian? And he divides it up into 2 bits. First is, he says that you have to believe in God and the immortality of the soul. I would certainly agree with that. That may be a little too minimalistic, but certainly both important, very valid.
Absolutely.
But many people believe in God and the immortality of the soul. So then step 2 is, he says you have to have some kind of belief in Christ. Here's where I take issue with him.
This might be the part that I like, too. We'll see.
Well, so he has this to say in the section entitled, What is a Christian? He says, then further than that, as the name implies, you must have some kind of belief about Christ. The Mohammedans, for instance, also believe in God and immortality, and yet they would not call themselves Christians. I think that you must have at the very lowest the belief that Christ was, if not divine, at least the best and wisest of men. And I think, while you can probably find some people who would call themselves Christian that don't hold to the divinity of Christ,
Sure.
that's not only extremely rare as far as official creeds go, but it would have been almost non-existent in Russell's time. Not just Catholic, but Protestant. The divinity of Christ is the foundation, cornerstone of basically every Christian creed.
Yeah.
So this is where I strongly have to disagree with Russell, is this minimalist approach to defining Christianity is fine. But if you remove the belief in the divinity of Christ, I don't think you've got any kind of traditional Christianity, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, you name it. And it's interesting because he mentions the Mohammedans here. Well, and he says they believe in God, but they wouldn't call themselves Christians. Well, even if they don't think Christ was the best and wisest of men, they certainly think he was one of the best and wisest of men. They hold him as a prophet.
That's true. So even Muslims would fall under that definition. And also Mohammedans, they wouldn't even call themselves Mohammedans. So
Right, I'm quoting, I'm quoting Russell here.
But this is another a critique of Russell on that point is that they wouldn't say that they're Mohammedans even. Can I see that real quick?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Just kind of to the point that I was going to make is.
And can you do the Russell accent?
I did a little bit of it already. Okay. I think that's as far
I just want to hear more of it.
As far as I'm comfortable going. I think that to just put it in, I mean, this was delivered in 1927.
1927.
That's almost 100 years ago.
For the National Secular Society.
Yeah. Sounds like a good bunch.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Jolly party.
And he was the chairman as he indicates at the beginning. I will say this, that perhaps it would be as well, first of all, to try to make out what one means by the word Christian. It is used these days in a very loose sense by a great many people. Some people mean no more by it than a person who attempts to live a good life. In that sense, I suppose there would be Christians in all sects and creeds, but I do not think that this is the proper sense of the word, if only because it would imply that all the people who are not Christians, all the Buddhists, Confucians, Mohammedans, and so on, are not trying to live a good life. I do not mean by a Christian any person who tries to live decently according to his lights. I think that you must have a certain amount of definite belief before you have a right to call yourself a Christian. The word does not have quite such a full-blooded meaning now as it had in the times of St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. In those days, if a man said that he was a Christian, it was known what he meant. You accepted a whole collection of creeds which were set out with great precision, and every single syllable of those creeds you believed with the whole strength of your convictions. I love that intro.
Yeah. No, it's a fantastic introduction, and I think he's spot on.
Yeah, on that portion, yes.
Absolutely agree.
I was still early. That was the part I'm like, oh, I love this. It's so good.
No, I think that is great. I think it's a fantastic introduction to this. But it's when he gets down to defining the Christians and is leaving out the divinity of Christ that it's sufficient to just think that Christ was the best and wisest of men. I've really got to take issue with that.
Problematic. I mean, even early Christians would divide themselves into, with the Arian heresy as heretics or Gnosticism. Yeah. In those times, even I don't think that those in early Christianity, I don't know if people with different beliefs about Christ would have been considered Christians.
Right. And what you see here, though, with this definition is that he kind of divides it into two halves. First is a belief in God in general and the immortality of the soul. And then the second part is this belief that Christ is the best and wisest of men. And as we go through this, we're going to see that the speech or essay is divided the same way. The first half, he looks at the various arguments for the existence of God. In the second half, he looks at whether or not Christ really was the best and wisest of men. And what's kind of interesting here is, you'll find throughout history a lot of atheists who will certainly say they think, Jesus was a very wonderful teacher and a good man and all this and that. They just don't think he was divine or that God exists.
Sure.
Russell's going to push a little further, and he says that, while he admires him on certain points, he does not think Christ was the best or wisest of men, right? So that'll be in the part
He even
two.
throws some people, he even goes as far as to list out a few folks he thinks are better.
Socrates and Buddha, I think.
I think
right?
Socrates
Yeah,
and Buddha
Excuse me.
get higher up the list than our Lord. But you know, Russell's welcome to his opinions here.
Now, before we get into the actual arguments, I find this really interesting. So while he's doing this defining of Christianity, he does add one more thing. And there is, you may know this, but if you don't, as a history buff, you'll find this really fascinating. He then continues by saying, "But for the successful efforts of unbelievers in the past, I could not take so elastic a definition of Christianity as that. As I said before, in olden days it had a much more full-blooded sense. For instance, it included the belief in hell. Belief in eternal hellfire was an essential item of Christian belief until pretty recent times. In this country, as you know, it ceased to be an essential item because of a decision of the Privy Council. And from that decision, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York dissented. But in this country, our religion is settled by Act of Parliament, and therefore the Privy Council was able to override their graces, and hell was no longer necessary to a Christian. Consequently, I shall not insist that a Christian must believe in hell." So one comment here is, talking about the wit of Russell, right? There's some just lovely kind of snide sarcasm in here about how Parliament gets to make up doctrines.
Yeah.
It's pretty awesome. But this does immediately ask the question, what is he talking about historically here?
Sure. Yeah. No. I'm.
Are you familiar with this?
No.
Okay,
No.
so this is great.
This is fun.
And I'm just going to have to say he's wrong. And so this is where right off the bat, as before we get into the more substantive arguments, the sort of misdefinition of Christianity and then this historical error.
Yeah.
When you see major problems like that right off the bat, does kind of make me question how solid the rest of this essay is going to be.
The uncharitable part of me, though, tends to, my knee-jerk reaction whenever I've read that is, well, Anglicanism is wrong. So, of course, they would get something else wrong. So he's wrong about this, too. Yeah,
so there's a historical reality that he's talking about here that really happened, but it's pretty interesting. So in 1860, this is shortly after the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, a book came out in England that was a collection of essays written by various clergymen, primarily, maybe completely. A couple of the essays were written by two clergymen, one with the last name of Williams, one with the last name of Wilson.
Okay.
Now,
the two dubs.
The Anglican Church is a state religion, and that's important. And I think that, we talk a lot about separation of church and state, and I think that's often approached from the perspective that you don't want a state religion because then the state is forcing people to believe certain things or to behave in certain ways. I would also say, though, for the religion, you don't want the state in charge of your religion because then the state gets to tell you what to believe, right? So it's a problem on both sides.
Sure.
And so this is a problem, and I think Russell would have issue with this, and I would agree with Russell on this point. Anglicanism was a state religion, and therefore, if a person preached heresy, or wrote heresy, or whatever, that went against the Anglican religion, it was a matter not of church law only, but of civil law, right? You were considered, I guess, a bad Englishman as well as a bad Anglican. So this collection of essays in 1860 appears at a time when a lot of what we would call higher criticism, a lot of literary scholarship was coming into play, and there was a lot of what would be seen as more liberal tendencies in this scholarship to deny the inspiration of scriptures, the historical validity of the Bible, all this kind of stuff.
This is when the historical critical method really comes about.
This is starting to get big at this time.
Sure.
So there was this kind of thing in this book, and a few of the essays caught people's attention and caused a big stir. They were deemed heretical, liberal, however you want to phrase that. And particularly, historically, the essays of Williams and Wilson became important. They were debated in the church, but it did eventually end up in Parliament. And Parliament decided to establish the Privy Council, he mentions here, which was comprised of 7 members. 4 were members of Parliament, 3 were upper churchmen, including, as he points out, the Archbishop of York and the Archbishop of Canterbury. There were 4 points up for debate. 4 points upon which these men were accused of heretical writing. One of them was this question of hell. Okay, so up to this point, everything that Russell is saying sounds to be right. And the Privy Council did, in fact, acquit them on all 4 counts. But now let's get to the nuance, because this is kind of important. The Privy Council was not attempting to change or define Christian dogma. That seems to be the impression he's giving here.
Sure, yeah.
Right? That's pretty obviously the impression.
And with some snark.
Yes. What they were trying to do was say, we have like clear published creed, right? There's beliefs of the Anglican Church. These men have been accused of writing things that are against those creeds. All they were attempting to determine was not if the creeds were true or not, but did these men in fact write something that was different than the creedal statements of the Anglican Church. Okay. I want to read something to you because this is directly from the results of the Privy Council. Lord Chancellor Westbury, in his statement on the judgment, has this to say. Mr. Wilson expresses a hope that at the day of judgment, those men who are not admitted to happiness may be so dealt with as that, quote, the perverted may be restored, end of quote, and all, quote, both small and great may ultimately find a refuge in the bosom of the universal parent. So the first thing that they're pointing out here is not that Mr. Wilson was explicitly denying hell, but rather hoping that it might be possible that it would come to an end or people would be reconciled. Lord Westbury then considers by saying that in the creeds and so forth, we don't find anything that says that that sort of hopeful thinking is clearly wrong, right? But here's the point I want to get at. Lord Westbury then says this, and I don't think it gets any clearer. We are not required or at liberty to express any opinion upon the mysterious question of the eternity of final punishment. So he's saying we're not making a doctrinal statement. We don't even have the liberty to do that. This is not our place whatsoever. The only thing that he continues by saying, further than to say that we do not find in the formularies to which this article refers any such distinct declaration of our church upon the subject as to require us to condemn the expression of hope by this clergyman. So you see there's a radical difference here. They're saying we don't think what Wilson wrote counts as heresy, not we're going to change Christian doctrine and say there is no hell. What you could argue is they might say that the belief in hell isn't part of the Christian creed. Okay, and there we're starting to lean more towards what Russell is saying. But at least Lord Westbury's statement is very clear that they have not attempted and they do not even have really the right to make doctrinal statements. But here's the kicker. This is where it gets really great. He says, going back to Russell, the decision of the Privy Council, and that was to acquit these 2 men on their charges of heresy. From that decision, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York dissented. No, they didn't.
They didn't dissent at all.
They did, but they dissented on the acquittal of one of the other ones that one of these men had denied the inspiration of Scripture, and these guys were acquitted on that. The Archbishops of Canterbury and York did dissent there. They're like, we think they did. But on this point about the eternal hellfire, they did not dissent from the Privy Council's opinion. So this is like totally wrong right here.
Yeah, it's
but it's kind of fun history.
It's amazing history, but it does lend to some of the credibility of not Lord Russell and his ideas, but sometimes it does feel as though he didn't do his homework on certain things. This one included, and then also the definition. I think that a basic understanding or basic catechesis of what Christians believe from any profession of faith would show, or what Muslims believe.
Not Mohammedans.
Yeah, not Mohammedans would show, that there is more to Christ and his divinity than what he lays forth. Yeah, that's super interesting.
Yeah. So I would say this in fairness to Russell, that this initial sort of opening statement here, it's not essential to the rest of what he's going to write. So I guess maybe I sound a little nitpicky. He's not basing any arguments later on upon these statements. But I do think it should kind of red flag us when we have some of these kind of major issues right off the bat, that maybe we're not diving into a work of the finest scholarship, or I
Right.
think that it should red flag that a little bit.
And
for
I think
us.
what you had spoken of previously. Also, he's preaching to his own choir too.
Yeah.
I do want to point that out.
No, that's a good point, because he's to be fair again, he is not really trying to set out a rigorous argument here. He is absolutely talking to people that hold the same kind of viewpoint as he does.
a dinner party with the what was the organization?
The National Secular Society.
The National Secular
I think it was the South
Society.
London branch of it.
Yeah. I do want to go into the next portion.
Yeah, because now he's going to start looking at the arguments for the existence of God.
So I do want to point out, previously it was just Christianity as a whole, but actually here is where I think the rubber really meets the road. And in my estimation, that the only two fair arguments in life, from my perspective and in my opinion, are either Lord Russell's arguments or the arguments of the Catholic Church. I think this is where it really shows that. So he begins to speak on the issue of the question of the existence of God, which he says is a large and serious question. And it says, of course, that the Catholic Church has laid it down as a dogma that the existence of God can be proved by unaided reason. And I think that, I think Catholicism is probably the only profession of Christianity that makes that bold of a claim.
Yes.
So it does set it up that really there's two worldviews.
Yeah. And I think individual
conflict.
Christians hold to that, but I think as kind of like a creedal or like really doctrinal statement, I think I'm not aware of any besides the Catholic Church has done that.
Yes.
And that was made not just a belief of, Catholic thinkers, philosophers, theologians throughout the ages, but that was actually stated in the First Vatican Council shortly before Russell's time here, that this is a matter of dogma.
Yeah. So,
and he has, could you read a little bit more of that, Erik? Because he has some interesting kind of strange things to say about that dogma.
does he? Okay.
I think it's a little peculiar.
That is a somewhat curious dogma.
Mm-hmm.
All right. That'd be a great name for a band. The Curious Dogmas.
Yeah.
But it is one of their dogmas. Okay. They had to introduce it. Okay, yeah, I see where you're going with this. They had to introduce it because at one time the free thinkers adopted the habit of saying that there were such and such arguments where reason might urge against the existence of God, but of course they knew as a matter of faith that God did exist. The arguments and reasons were set out at great length, and the Catholic Church felt that they must stop it. Therefore, they laid it down that the existence of God can be proved by the unaided reason, and they had to set up what they considered were arguments to prove it. There are, of course, a number of them, but I shall take only a few.
So I think what strikes me here, and I think this is something that we're going to see throughout this work. Look, every one of us are prone to prejudice. Prejudice for what we believe, prejudice for our side, our group, right? We're going to be prone to that. But I think it shows kind of badly in this essay, and maybe elsewhere as well, that not much can be said positive of Christianity. And this is an example of that. Yes, when this dogma was stated in the First Vatican Council, maybe it was a direct response to some of the free thinkers of the time that he was talking about. But this sounds as if it is a heavy-handed backlash against free thinkers, and we got to put a stop to it. This was not a novel idea in the Catholic Church. St. Thomas Aquinas believed you could prove the existence of God from unaided reason. St. Augustine did. We can go back pre-Christian. We can go back to Aristotle, right? This is not a brand new idea designed to stifle free thinking. And it also makes it sound as if
it's an idea that's come from free thinking.
Yes, definitely. And you look at the Greek philosophers, they were going against the paganism of their time when they did arrive at the idea of one God.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And there's also this feeling here of the Catholic Church couldn't handle the arguments against the existence of God, so they just had to respond to the dogmatic statement. Well, I think if we want to be open and honest on this question, we're going to find to this very day a Catholic Church still doing admirably well in defending these arguments.
Right. I also want to point out, too, I really do like how he says, the Catholic Church felt, if only our church now, I mean, you see all these divisions and stuff, not even amongst the laity, but among bishops and...
It used to be a unified front.
Well, I don't know if it was. I don't know if it ever has been.
I guess the perception was there.
So I don't know, or maybe from Lord Russell, but I don't know if it ever did move. People always talk about how clunky and how slow moving the church is, and to some extent that can be true.
Yeah.
But I think, if the church just decided one day in some committee meeting, we must stop these free thinkers in their tracks, like that would be a much more efficient church than we currently see, and definitely more united, as our Lord prays for it to be. Yeah. I don't think that this was the church of Russell's time. I don't think it was any better off then than it is now, to be completely honest, or at any other point in its history. Exactly.
Yeah. There have been, debate and questions and divisions throughout history. Yes, the church, unlike most other churches, the Catholic Church does have an official position, an official dogma, an official head of the church, right? We do have that. But that doesn't mean that as we kind of, go down the branches there, that we don't find 2,000 years of, debate, conflict, and division happening. It's human nature. There's always going to be these kind of things. And also, to your point about a quick committee meeting, councils tend to not be very short. Now, the First Vatican Council never even finished, right? Because war interrupted.
They had to get out of there, yeah.
But look at the Second Vatican Council. How long was that? 7 years, something? I mean, it went on for years.
Yeah, well, it depends. And too, if you look at the council documents of each of the sessions and everything, depends on who was Pope. John the 23rd only got so much finished,
right,
before he died, but. Also, his council was a lot slower moving. Paul VI was definitely an operator with it. It was like, all right, let's pick up this pace. So it depends on who's in charge and who God in His providence has leading the church, and not just the Pope, but the other bishops as well in that point in history.
But I agree with you, Eric. I think there's this kind of idea in this passage of, here's this church, it saw some problems and made this quick decision saying, we got to stamp out these free thinkers. And that's maybe a little bit of a simplistic...
It's super simplistic. And many of the issues within the church, historical issues, arise from its complexity, from it being integrated so much into the secular life.
The free thinkers were in the church as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Sometimes in high positions, and still are. That's nothing new.
Yeah.
I did want to say one thing before we get into these actual arguments. I remember many years ago reading Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything.
I like how he keeps those titles brief.
Yes, very, very short titles.
Yeah.
And there's a feeling there that I also get from Russell, and I mentioned this a little while ago, what I would kind of call that prejudice, where he can't see much good about, Christianity or religion in general.
Yeah.
And because that was Hitchens' point, and you'll see Russell doing this as well, it's not just Christianity he objects to, but all religions. He thinks religions are poisonous, basically, right? Religion is bad per se. And so with that worldview...
That's why he can't even... that's why he'll refer to a religion as Mohammedans.
Yes. With that worldview, he just can't see anything positive, right? And Hitchens kind of suffered from that. But there's a co-opting of history here that I really don't like. So one of the things I found in Hitchens towards the end, he tries to deal with these questions of, well, hasn't atheism also led to a lot of abuses and, deaths and wars and all this? And he looks at communism, and Hitchens says, well, no, communism's a religion.
Yeah.
Well, it certainly does behave like a religion, but it's a religion which is explicitly atheistic, right? That's a bit of an easy cop-out. You know, when you look at the 120 million people slaughtered over the last century by atheistic regimes, and this is brought to Hitchens' attention, because he's trying to say religion's bad and poisons everything. We need to be like enlightened atheistic freethinkers. And so you point out, well, atheism's done a lot of damage.
Sure.
He cuts
a lot
out
of damage.
He cuts out that entire history by relabeling and saying, well, no, that's actually a religion. And then he also looks at some what people like himself would respect, some sort of enlightened thinkers of 100 or 200 years before him, and has the gall to basically say that if they were in his time, they would have been atheists. So he knew what they were thinking, right? They were apparently only Christians because that was how they were raised.
He could read hearts, yeah.
Yeah, they would have been. So this is, and I think anybody can see this, that thinks about this honestly and fairly. This is really, really bad twisting of history to your own advantage. When you're going to look at the good people on the other side and say, well, they weren't really on your side. They should have been on my side. And the bad people on my side, they're not really on my side. I'm going to relabel them. I'm going to push them back over on your side.
And I mean, there's so many great thinkers in history that I love. You know, Maimonides.
Yeah.
The pagans, Plato.
Excuse me.
Even even I guess more of the troublesome ones, Spinoza, Russell.
Yeah.
I would never go back and go, well, these guys are all actually Catholics.
Right. Exactly.
It's just not.
They
it's
were
just an
Catholic
untrue.
at heart. They just didn't understand.
If they knew what I know, they would have been Catholics.
If I presented my arguments to them, they would have believed instantly.
And none of us, no matter what, it's just not a fair assessment. None of us exist outside of the times that God has put us in in His providence. Our lives are, I mean, it seems obvious, but are so interconnected with our times, with our experiences, with the other people that are on the planet at the same time as we are. It just doesn't line up, to say those things. Before we get into the argument, do you think we should take a break?
Yeah, I think this would probably be a good time for a short break. But as we go into that, just to round out this conversation, where I was saying that it seems like Russell and some of these others can't find anything really good to say about religion.
Yeah.
And not much bad to say about the other side.
Yeah.
I just want to read one little tiny thing here. This is from a different essay called Has Religion Made Useful Contributions to Civilization? Have you read this one?
No, I have not read this at all.
First published in 1930. And I just want to read this first paragraph, couple of sentences. And again, look, I'm a Christian. I'm far from being an atheist. But again, I have to give Russell props on this sort of witty, snobbish, like...
It's so good. It's so good.
Right?
So well written.
My own view on religion, no, I'm not going to do it, is that of Lucretius. I regard it as a disease born of fear and as a source of untold misery to the human race. I cannot, however, deny that it has made some contributions to civilization. It helped in early days to fix the calendar, and it caused Egyptian priests to chronicle eclipses with such care that in time they became able to predict them. These two services I am prepared to acknowledge, but I do not know of any others. Okay, the only thing I want to say about this is that Russell graduated from Cambridge, which was a Catholic university founded around 1207. Right? So the whole idea of a university is a Catholic idea. So I think without much difficulty, he probably could have thought of at least one more useful contribution religion has made besides eclipses and calendars. So yeah, there might just be a little hint of prejudice running through some of that.
He is right in the sense, I think the Egyptians, not in the sense that there aren't other benefits, even from an atheistic or agnostic worldview. But I think too with the Egyptians, I mean, they got a calendar down to 365 days of the year.
Really?
They were only 8 hours off.
Wow, that's amazing.
Over time, I think it was making the Easter Vigil later and later, and that's how I think we get to get away from geocentrism to heliocentrism.
Interesting.
Is to figure out why the Easter Vigil is getting so darn late every year. Yeah.
That's interesting. Well, I think it is a great place to take a break. And when we come back, we can start looking into how Russell views the traditional arguments that Christians make for the existence of God. So let's take a short pause, and we'll be right back with more on Spirit and Spire.
Hey everyone, this week's episode is sponsored by Family Renewal Project. FRP is a local theology of the body apostolate in service to the Archdiocese of Louisville. They're dedicated to renewing the culture through the renewal of the family. They have so many amazing things going on, so check them out at familyrenewalproject.com.
Welcome back to Spirit and Spire. We're back after a short break, so we've been discussing Lord Bertrand Russell's essay, Why I Am Not a Christian. And in the last segment, we were kind of talking about the introductory sections of it. And now we're kind of ready for where he actually begins to deal with the question of the existence of God.
Yes.
Right? And one of the things we want to do is be really, really fair here. You know, we don't agree with Russell, but we do want to be really fair. And Erik, as you pointed out, he is definitely preaching to the choir here. He's not trying to really lay out a thesis paper with fine points and all of that. That being said, he does at some point make an accusation of theists believing fallacies. I've got to say there's some here in this essay as well. And one of them that I think exists in every single section that he does on the proofs for the existence of God is straw man arguments.
Yeah.
I don't think he presents these proofs well. The first one, and it's probably the only one we're going to get through today, is the so-called first cause argument. And I would just like to say a few words about this, because in one of our later episodes, as we do this series, we're going to start looking in depth into the arguments for the existence of God.
Right.
And the first cause argument's a big one.
Yeah.
One of the people very famous for that is my hero, St. Thomas Aquinas. Right? He puts forward a version of that in the Summa Theologica, in the Prima Pars. And I'm going to say that Russell it does not quote Thomas. He's not saying this is Thomas's argument. But I just want to give a little background here, because I think it's important.
Sure.
He does get the first cause argument wrong, as we'll see in a moment. But I think that even a lot of Christians misunderstand the first cause argument. So I do just kind of want to clarify one thing. What we're looking at here is the idea, if we see an effect, we recognize it has to have a cause. And if that thing was also caused, then it had to have a cause, and that had to have a cause, and on we go. And the basic form of the argument is going to say that you can't go on forever. You've got to come down to a first cause, which is uncaused.
Sure.
Well, one of the problems is we need to understand what is meant by first. And while there may be some Christian philosophers and thinkers who have formulated this argument in terms of temporally first, in other words, first in time, that is not what Thomas does. Thomas means first cause and sense of priority. And the reason I bring this up is because we're going to see at some point here Russell kind of asking the question of, maybe the universe doesn't have a beginning at all. So why do we have to bother with there being a first cause? And I think this is really, really good to chat about for a moment. St. Thomas understood this very, very well. He accepted the fact that the universe was created and has a beginning. He accepted that fact as a matter of faith. But interestingly enough, he did not think it could be proven. And it was fairly common in his day, this comes from Aristotle. So among the medievals and in Islam, a lot of them were getting really big into Aristotle, and so a number of them sort of accepted this idea that the universe had been around from all eternity.
Sure.
We have today, the term for this today is frequently called the Kalam cosmological argument. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And the basic idea...
William Lane Craig.
Yep, Dr. Craig, he named it that. But the Kalam cosmological argument is something which really kind of came from the medieval Islamic philosophers. Well, from one of them in particular, Al-Ghazali.
Great name.
It's a fantastic name. His real name is like really long and complicated, but he's called Al-Ghazali.
Yeah.
So,
Which means the Ghazali?
I guess so.
Yeah.
I guess so.
I don't know.
So St. Thomas, kind of opposed to this idea, wrote an entire treatise called On the Eternity of the World. And this is pretty interesting because his whole point in this treatise is to say that all the arguments that he was aware of to attempt to prove from reason that the universe had a beginning fail. Right? Thomas is playing devil's advocate here. He writes an entire treatise to say you cannot prove there's a beginning of the universe. So it seems highly unlikely that he's using a first cause argument to say there's a beginning to the universe.
Right.
He doesn't mean that at all. The great analogy here comes, I think, from St. Augustine. St. Augustine uses the example of a foot standing in sand, creating a footprint. And he says, suppose the foot and the footprint had both been there from all eternity. We would still recognize that the footprint was caused by the foot. So very similarly, what Thomas is doing is saying that even if the universe existed from all eternity, the nature of the universe is contingent, is dependent. It has to have something to explain it, right? It does not explain itself. So Thomas is not doing science or history here to find a beginning of the universe. He's doing metaphysics. He's saying the very nature of natural things is such that they cannot explain themselves. Even if they existed from all eternity, they still demand a creator which created them from all eternity. So at least when St. Thomas says first cause, he does not mean first in order of time, he means first in order of priority. Think of a plant hanging on a chain in a hook in the ceiling. They all hang simultaneously, but the pot and the chain are dependent upon the hook. Right. So that's where Thomas is going. Now, I don't know, because I think people, including Christians, misunderstand this argument. I don't know who Russell was familiar with that was putting forth the first cause arguments in his day, so I'm going to totally give him a pass here. But he is certainly presenting this as if it was an example of a chain of causes going back in time, and therefore you have to arrive at a first one. And I don't think at least any good Catholic philosopher would make that claim that that's what the argument is. But enough of me talking about it. Let's read this short little bit from Russell and see what he says.
All right, let's check it out.
Perhaps the simplest and easy to understand is the argument of the first cause. It is maintained that everything we see in this world has a cause, and as you go back in the chain of causes further and further, you must come to a first cause, and to that first cause you give the name of God. That argument, I suppose, does not carry very much weight nowadays, because in the first place, cause is not quite what it used to be. The philosophers and the men of science have got going on cause, and it has not anything like the vitality it used to have. But apart from that, you can see that the argument that there must be a first cause is one that cannot have any validity. Well, he's very certain about this, isn't he?
Yeah.
I may say that when I was a young man...
I'm not that certain about anything.
Yeah, right?
Man.
Well, maybe some things, but I may say that when I was a young man and was debating these questions very seriously in my mind, I for a long time accepted the argument of the first cause. Until one day, at the age of 18, I read John Stuart Mill's autobiography, and I there found this sentence. My father taught me that the question, who made me, cannot be answered, since it immediately suggests the further question, who made God? I'm just going to pause here and mention, as others have pointed out, especially since, as we'll see, he gets the first cause argument completely wrong, that it is really remarkable for a scholarly, brilliant man that he read one line one day at the age of 18 from Mills's autobiography, accepted it point blank, and just changed his mind.
Never questioned it again. And then remembered it to tell a bunch of his atheistic comrades in 1923.
27, yeah.
27.
That very simple sentence showed me, as I still think, the fallacy in the argument of the first cause. We'll see the fallacy here is that he's presenting this as a straw man argument. If everything must have a cause, then God must have a cause. I'm going to circle back to that when we dissect this in a moment. If there can be anything without a cause, it may just as well be the world as God, so that there cannot be any validity in that argument. It is exactly of the same nature as the Hindus' view that the world rested upon an elephant, and the elephant rested upon a tortoise. And when they said, "How about the tortoise?" the Indians said, "Suppose we change the subject." The argument is really no better than that. There is no reason why the world could not have come into being without a cause. That makes me raise my eyebrow right there. Nor, on the other hand, is there any reason why it should not have always existed. There is no reason to suppose the world had a beginning at all. The idea that things must have a beginning is really due to the poverty of our imagination. Therefore, perhaps I need not waste any more time upon the argument about the first cause. And I would agree with Russell there because he hasn't wasted any time upon the actual first cause argument at all.
Yeah.
There's my snide.
You didn't even start.
You didn't even start. Before I get into some of this, you were telling me something really cool last night about the the world on the back of the elephant, the tortoise.
The contingency.
Tell us a little about that.
So, I mean, the argument he really butchers. I'm sure folks are probably aware there was is it John Green, the writer? There's a more contemporary writer who wrote a book called Turtles All the Way Down.
Okay.
So that phrase, turtles all the way down, it's pretty popular in the last 10 years or so. But that's the actual punchline here. And I think it's funny, not only does he get the first cause argument wrong, but he starts to talk about, let's see, it is exactly of the same nature as the Hindus' view that the world rested upon an elephant, and the elephant rested upon a tortoise. Usually they say rested upon a turtle. And when they say, how about the tortoise? How about the turtle? The punchline is, it's just turtles all the way down, which is hilarious.
Because it's kind of a joke more than it's not really an argument.
Well, it's still a it's still an argument. To say it's just infinite turtles, the infinite regress of turtles.
Ironically, is the atheist position.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. So he not only does he bring it up to kind of turn it around, but he butchers. He doesn't even hit the punchline. He said,
Let's change the subject.
Let's change the subject. And we spoke about earlier the Copleston debate.
Yes.
And on a very similar point of not necessarily the first cause argument, but on a cosmological argument.
I think it was a contingency argument, Leibniz's contingency argument they were discussing.
So it's very early on, the contingency argument, and Copleston and Russell are debating on this for quite some time. And it gets to a point where, so the necessary and the contingent being, I guess just to summarize it rather quickly, is that, as he says here, when he talks about John Stuart Mill's father, that who made me cannot be answered since it immediately suggests the further question, who made God? That, if God made the universe, then who made God? I guess is the argument. But he tries to pull this one on Copleston, and Copleston goes into detail about how we are all contingent beings in this world. Right. I wouldn't exist if my parents hadn't have fallen in love, et cetera, et cetera. We're all contingent on other things outside of our control. Whereas God is a necessary being.
And the kind of the stage two in there, because this comes from Leibniz, is we do see contingent things, and if it's contingent, that means that it has a dependency or an explanation is required for it. But that explanation, if that's another contingent thing, right, you have to have an explanation for that and so forth. Sure. So then the stage two is that not the entire sum total of reality cannot be contingent, because then it's dependent on something outside of itself. But wait, there is no outside of reality, so you have a contradiction. Sure. Therefore, you have to say there is something which is not contingent, which is in fact necessary. And Copleston's trying to push him into this, right? He's trying to say there has to be a necessary being. Yeah.
And then Russell, once he gets down to it, first off, he says, he really doesn't like the word necessary.
Yeah.
He just kind of nitpicks on that, I feel, a little bit. I'm sure someone smarter than I am could maybe elaborate a little on that. But he nitpicks on the word necessary until finally it gets down to him just saying, well, I'd rather let's talk about something else, which is exactly what he claims that the Indian would do in his story. The other thing that's funny about that is, India, we were talking about the Mohammedan thing. India is one of the most religiously pluralistic countries. So him even making that call out while butchering the punchline is a little bit funny to me. Probably nitpicking at this point.
He probably wouldn't be considered terribly PC today.
Yeah. I mean, to think about India, in Kerala, there's Christians that were evangelized very early by St. Thomas.
Yeah.
There's Christians in Goa that were evangelized by St. Francis Xavier, and the Portuguese much later. In Punjab, I mean, mostly Sikhism, which is also a monotheistic religion. Jainism and their ways of ahimsa come from that. I know it's current day Nepal where Buddhism originates, but there's definitely portions of India that are heavily Buddhist. Then you get down to Hinduism, which is a pluralistic religion in its own right. It's not like Christianity where there's just different sects, and it's more of an amalgamation of ideas and beliefs and practices that they've lumped together than anything else. So to just say an Indian guy would say that, I don't know how many... I'm sure the Indian guy would actually just say there's turtles all the way down and think it's funny because he would get the punchline.
Yeah, he probably would.
Unlike Lord Russell, who completely missed the point in my estimation.
But I'm glad you brought that connection with the debate, because it's a great moment of the debate, and it is a really kind of humorous and ironic connection that he does this here. And then it's really precisely on that very same point where Copleston is pushing him back to, like, we've got to get back to not a first cause, but a necessary being, right? Because they're running a contingency argument there. And Russell, if I remember, actually kind of comes to the point of just saying that the question itself of whether or not the universe has a cause is a question that to him just doesn't even make sense, right? Like, it's just a kind of like a question you can't even ask. It's just, it's utterly nonsensical. And Father Copleston is kind of like, well, then I guess we're not going to get any further on this point, right? If you don't even, like, we can't even talk about the question in so many words. And he's like, yes, I'd rather move on to something else, and I'm getting bored. You know, so
But it's so polite. It's so good. It's very wholesome.
Okay, so what's the problem here? His argument, I've said already that it's a straw man. And I want to just read again these two very short sentences. If everything must have a cause, then God must have a cause. If there can be anything without a cause, it may as just well be the world as God. So there cannot be any validity in that argument. Well, that sounds really fine and dandy on his part, right? Pretty reasonable. Right. Except for the fact that, as I said, it is a straw man. So this sentence we really need to focus in on. If everything must have a cause, then God must have a cause. This is the point he keeps trying to hammer home here. This is in the John Stuart Mill's autobiography quote. My father taught me the question who made me cannot be answered, since it immediately suggests a further question, who made God? I do not know of one single Christian philosopher ever who literally said everything must have a cause. Every contingent thing must have a cause, right? Everything that is not metaphysically simple must have a cause, right? There's many different ways we can parse this out.
Sure.
But no philosopher worth their salt would ever say everything must have a cause, because you would run precisely into the problem that that Russell is saying here, that, well, then, yes, God would have a cause, and whatever cause God would have a cause, and you're just going this infinite regress, and it all makes no sense eventually.
Yeah. It's just turtles all the way down.
It's turtles all the way down, right? I have never, this is total straw man argument, I have never seen the first cause argument presented with the premise everything must have a cause. Never. Now, what I would say is that everything has an explanation. God is self-explanatory. Other things require an extrinsic explanation, something outside of themselves. These are the contingent things. The entire point of the first cause argument is actually to say not everything has a cause, right? There has to be something which is uncaused, namely God, right? So It's a great little paragraph here. It's humorous. It's clever, as I said. I love his writing. I mean, I really do. It's fantastically enjoyable to read. But we do have to say at the end of the day, this is not a presentation of the first cause argument whatsoever.
Yeah.
But then the next point is no better, because he says, so this is on the one side. If everything must have a cause, he's giving us two options. Then God must have a cause.
Right.
Okay, well, that's not the first cause argument, so we're going to discount that. Then he says, if there can be anything without a cause, it may as just well be the world as God. Well, I think in a future episode we'll treat of this, but this goes back to my point about St. Thomas. What Russell is saying here does sound reasonable. If the Christian or theist is going to say there could be something that doesn't require a cause, why couldn't that be the universe? Why couldn't that be the world? And this is where Thomas and other thinkers are going to demonstrate that the very nature of the universe is contingent. And we can demonstrate that in many ways. It's limited, it's restricted, it changes, it doesn't have, its own explanation within itself, right? And so there are ways to demonstrate that the world or universe cannot be the uncaused thing. We have to find something transcendent to the universe to find that uncaused cause, right? And on that same point, he then says this, I struggle with this. And I admit that this has kind of become a thing in modern atheism, the idea of what we would call brute facts. So traditionally, when philosophers would look at things which are contingent, and by contingent we just mean they depend on something else, or they require an explanation outside of themselves. They're not self-sufficient, so to speak. We would say, well, okay, contingent things require a cause. Well, now there is this idea called brute facts that we can look at contingent things, so the argument runs, and say they're contingent, they're not necessary beings like God, but they don't have any explanation, nothing caused them. That's kind of, to me, that's sort of intellectually troubling, and maybe we'll chat about this in a future episode, but it's become a big idea. And I think Russell may be one of the first modern philosophers to kind of try to promote this idea, though he doesn't use the word brute fact. But he says right here, there is no reason why the world could not have come into being without a cause. Nor, on the other hand, is there any reason why it should not have always existed. I'd be a little more, I don't agree with it, but I'd be a little more sympathetic to the second part. At least if the universe has existed from all eternity, let's say. I could see how a person could imagine it didn't require a cause, right? I think we can prove it does, but I could at least see how that could seem reasonable.
Sure.
But to say that there is no reason why the world could not have come into being without a cause. Now this is troubling. Because here he's saying there could be a case in which the universe wasn't eternal. It actually pops into existence, but nothing made that happen. Well, the universe can't explain that cause because it didn't exist prior to itself, right?
Sure.
So we are forced to say, why did this happen?
Even if it's an atheistic worldview of why it happened.
Like what's the quantum balance theory, right? Or something like that,
Sure.
or a multiverse or something. But you can't. This is literally saying that something can come from nothing. That is quite simply, that being can come from non-being with no explanation whatsoever.
And even
Boy, that's a hard thing for me to accept.
Even that which is lesser has to come from that which is greater. It's not, you can't have something greater come from something lesser.
The effect cannot be greater than its cause.
Yeah. I do want to point out, before we move on, these are more cosmological arguments, very heady. He does get into some moral qualms, and we spoke about this a little bit with Christianity. Maybe we could go over one of those. I know that's skipping ahead quite a bit, particularly the fig tree.
Yes. Okay, so this is great because, as we mentioned earlier on, he divides this into two sections based on his definition of Christianity, right? That on one side, you got to believe in God. On the other side, you got to believe that Jesus is the best and wisest of men.
Sure.
So for a few more pages, he's going to keep going over different arguments for God, the natural law argument, the argument from design,
which even if he isn't getting all these arguments correct, at least he's thorough enough to address them.
These are pretty major arguments.
Maybe in title only.
Yeah.
He's addressing them.
And then part 2 is the character of Christ. So here's where he's going to say, not only does he think he's demonstrated that God doesn't exist, but that also that Christ is not the best and wisest of men.
He's third best.
Third, yeah, apparently.
Who's first, Socrates or Buddha?
He says Socrates and Buddha. He does not say which one comes first.
I really want to know his rankings, but
it's kind of troubling, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the whole. That's
maybe
what
it was a tie for first.
Yeah, it was a tie for first, and Jesus is number 2.
That could be it. So, and we'll get to the fig tree thing here in a second. But one of the things that, frankly, just kind of I think it amuses me more than irritates me. But I see this happen a lot now in our times, and so I think it does actually irritate me as well, is as Christians, we may often debate over the meaning of a scriptural passage. And there's this risk of taking verses out of context or whatever it might be, right?
Sure.
But at least I kind of feel that it's fair to say these are Christian scriptures, so let the Christians have some say in what they mean. And I do find it sort of humorous and sort of annoying at the same time that, we have a lot of atheists that pick and choose Bible verses and try to tell us what they mean.
Yeah.
Right? And in this case, he does so very badly. So he begins by saying some positive things about Christ, to say he was good-ish and wise-ish. But then he's going to talk about the defects in Christ's teaching and Christ's moral character. But what about the good stuff?
I can also some of anything he finds defective as a Christian. I feel like I've critically looked at and this isn't from a place of pride, but I can think of critical arguments that I feel like are a lot stronger.
I agree.
When I read scripture, but anyways.
Well, just like I think St. Thomas Aquinas came up with the best arguments for atheism.
Yeah.
Which I might mention that in a moment.
Yeah.
So he says that I now want to say a few words upon a topic which I often think is not quite sufficiently dealt with by rationalists, and that is the question whether Christ was the best and wisest of men. It is generally taken for granted that we should all agree that that was so. I do not myself. I think that there are a good many points upon which I agree with Christ a great deal more than the professing Christians do. I do not know that I could go with him all the way, but I can go with him much further than most professing Christians can. And I'll be fair here, obviously Christians fail to live up to Christ's standard all the time, so, I'll grant him that. Also, we believe Christ is divine and we're not, so of course we're going to say that Christ is at a higher level than professing Christians, certainly. But then he goes on to quote some maxims from Christ, right? Some things that he really likes, like about turning the other cheek, judge not lest you be not judged, etc. Unfortunately, these verses are sometimes taken out of context. So here's the one I wanted to focus in on. And let me find it. Yes. There is one other maxim of Christ, which I think has a great deal in it, but I do not find it is very popular among some of our Christian friends. He, that is Christ, says, "If thou wilt be perfect, go and sell that which thou hast and give to the poor." That is a very excellent maxim, but as I say, it is not much practiced. All these, I think, are good maxims, although they are a little difficult to live up to. I do not profess to live up to them myself, but then after all, it is not quite the same thing as for a Christian.
Also, this is called Why I'm Not a Christian, so fair enough.
Yeah.
Bertrand Russell.
But the problem here is that verse, if you'll be perfect, go and sell what you have and give to the poor, is badly taken out of context. As you remember, Eric, this is the example of the rich young man who comes to Jesus, and he wants to know what he needs to do to be perfect. And Jesus tells him to adhere to certain points of the law or whatever. And he says, I've been doing all these things since I was a kid. And Jesus realizes this is a very good man. Says he looks at him and he loved him. And he said, one thing you still lack. If you would be perfect, go and sell what you have and give to the poor. That was obviously Christ recognized that this man was attached to his possessions. Yeah. He was following the law, but lacking in charity.
Sure.
He needed this lesson to let go of these material goods and learn to have a heart of love and give to the poor.
Yes.
This is not a maxim. Right? And so by pulling this out of context, he literally says it is a maxim of Christ. There is not a single word anywhere in the Bible that says that this is a general rule for all believers. You give all you have and sell to the poor.
Yeah.
Of course, if you did, this would bring up the other questions of, well, who would you sell to? They better have money to buy it. And then once the poor have all the goods, are they supposed to then sell them and give them away?
Do you just give them back and forth?
I guess that's the idea. But so this is kind of the problem here, is he's just pulling verses out, right? It's like really bad exegesis in a sense.
Yeah.
And trying to tell us their maxims and what they mean.
He's a philosopher, but he's not a scripture scholar by any means. And
which is fine. But don't try to be one, maybe.
Right. And I feel like if I were to sit down and try to write a book on logic, that it would be equally flawed.
Yes.
Or even to give a speech on logic. So I'm not going to do that, or not going to do that anytime soon, unless I had the credentials of Lord Russell here. But yeah.
Well, you want to hear about the fig tree?
Oh, I love the fig tree. The fig tree is probably the standout statement he makes in the entire book, or the entire lecture, in my opinion.
So now he says the next part is defects in Christ's teaching. So he says there's some mistakes Christ made, and then he has the moral problem, and this is where he thinks that Christ doesn't really have a very good moral character. His principal reason being because Jesus believed in hell, and he thinks that that's just a nasty, vicious thing for anybody to believe in and to push off on other people. Therefore, Christ was not a very nice guy. Does he do? Yeah, he does a couple of different treatments of, yeah. So then he says, then there is the curious story of the fig tree, which always rather puzzled me. You remember what happened about the fig tree. He was hungry, and seeing a fig tree afar off, having leaves, he came, if haply he might find anything thereon. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for the time of figs was not yet. And Jesus answered and said unto it, No man eat fruit of thee hereafter forever. And then it kind of skips a little bit. And Peter saith unto him, Master, behold, the fig tree which thou cursed is withered away. This is a very curious story, because it was not the right time of the year for figs, and you really could not blame the tree. I cannot myself feel that either in the matter of wisdom or in the matter of virtue, Christ stands quite as high as some other people known to history. I think I should put Buddha and Socrates above him in those respects. All right, Erik, give us your thoughts about the fig tree.
Yeah, the Bodhi tree is the one that Buddha sat underneath.
Oh, yes.
After he abandoned his entire family.
He was
to live in asceticism, which not a dig on Siddhartha Gautama, but
it could be.
But there's not, there's no contrast, right? I could use that argument on the Buddha, and that seems far worse than getting mad at a tree because it didn't give you food and making it wither. So, I mean, my exegesis of the scripture, what does it actually mean? Is it doesn't seem fair because he doesn't even try to figure out what that's trying to communicate to us.
And it would be one thing if we had looked at the scriptures and discovered it was not the time for figs, but the gospel writer is quite tells you this, right?
Which guy? I don't think it's Matthew. Which one tells us this? I can't recall.
Maybe Mark? I'm not sure.
Yeah, one of the gospel writers makes a point to tell you.
Yeah, they're not trying to hide the fact that it was the wrong time for figs.
Sure. So in that passage, there's plenty that the church fathers have said on this. But I mean, to me, it seems pretty clear as it's leading up to the crucifixion of Christ that at the time he is God, and when he's going to be crucified, innocently, brought to be crucified, he could just annihilate everyone just with his will. If he could just become mildly annoyed at a tree and it withers up forever. Yet, if, so he must have had perfect charity. It shows that he had perfect compassion, that people would spit in his face, that they would beat him, that they would whip him, that they would crucify him in front of his own mother while he's young. All these terrible things, yelling insults. The people who literally days before, his disciples turn on him.
Yeah.
The people
saying Hosanna a few days before.
The people of Jerusalem were saying Hosanna, and the reason he couldn't be arrested earlier was fear of the people. And these are the same people who are yelling, crucify him, his people. And so like immediately he could annihilate them. And they yell, let his blood be on us. But the blood of Christ, instead of, if someone's blood is on your hands in any other context, oh, you're a murderer. But
right.
It's the blood of Christ. It's redemptive.
Right.
It's what is on all people, all sinners, all people of this world. So with the example of the fig tree, it's showing his power. Mm-hmm. And it also, if you read it in the context of the entire gospel, take your pick, whichever one has this passage in it, read it all the way through. I know Matthew does as well. It shows that Christ has that power, but he has that compassion and that love for the world and for man.
And he says this too in the Garden of Gethsemane when Peter takes out his sword and cuts off the high priest's servant's ear with it, because he's trying to protect Jesus. He's trying to keep him from being arrested, and Jesus tells him to put up the sword. And then he says, do you not know that I could call for thousands of angels right now? Sure. Right? So he fully has this power. He's setting that power aside. Also, there is a theme here, I think, because we have parables of Christ. We've got the one about the tenant farmers, where this man, nobleman, whoever, plants a vineyard, and he has people there that are supposed to, gather the fruit from it, and then he sends people, and we know this represents the prophets, to get the fruit, the portion of the fruit that was due to him, and they beat them up and kill them and send them away.
Sure.
So the fig tree was considered a symbol of Israel.
Yeah.
And I think part of what is going on here is...
A lot of the fathers get into this.
Yeah, it's a very strong statement of Christ saying, prophets have been sent, all this and that. There's supposed to be a spiritual fruit. God planted this tree. He gave you this religion, helped you all these things, but you're not producing the fruit you're supposed to. And we have given it season after season after season after season, right? But forgetting of just the scriptural, the possible meanings of this admittedly rather peculiar passage, excuse me, I think that Russell should at least try to put himself into the Christian shoes here a little bit, and remember that we do actually think Christ is divine. And to be completely fair, he has, if Christ is God and God created all things from nothing, he has full authority over those things.
Sure.
And at least as far as we know, fig trees don't feel pain or have immortal souls or anything. So if Christ wants to use this fig tree as a symbol, as an example, something that his disciples and the people needed to see, and he chooses to make it wither, I don't see that there was a moral defect there. And he is fully, if anybody, in his right to have done so.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a very strong argument against the moral goodness of Christ.
Yeah, but Socrates never did that.
No, Buddha never did either.
Buddha never cursed the fig tree. Yeah.
Excuse me.
Which, I don't know. I'm sure Socrates had fig trees. I don't know if Buddha did. I don't know if they go that far.
Yeah, Socrates. Well, I don't know if he would have owned fig trees, but I'm sure
he would have experienced them, perhaps.
Yeah. So, Eric, this is probably it's been fun. I've enjoyed this, but I think I didn't know how much we get through. I think we've got one, maybe two more episodes just on the Bertrand Russell essay.
Right.
Pardon me. Got all choked up about this.
Yeah.
So maybe this would be a really good time to pause for today, because again, looking at these two halves, when we go back to the arguments for the existence of God, he has the natural law argument, which I haven't looked at, the argument from design, the moral arguments, the argument for injustice. So we've got a handful more there to look at. And then the second part, the character of Christ and Christ's teachings and moral problems, are full of some really, really fun stuff to look into.
Yeah. Great stuff.
Yeah, it's been a good introduction. I'm glad we're going through this. I think it's really fun to kind of work through this essay and talk about it. And then, future episodes, we can dig into some of the arguments to the existence of God. Pardon me. But one thing you mentioned to me last night before we close, and I think it's important to bring this up, is I don't want to caricature here. We've talked about the new atheists a bit today.
Sure.
We talked about this particular essay from Bertrand Russell. There are phenomenal atheists out there who have far better arguments.
Including Bertrand Russell, who I think correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know what his answer to being called an atheist was, but I know in the Copleston debate, he did say, by their terms, he would go by an agnostic.
Agnostic, probably.
Because of their very, they had very precise terms, but he said then even, I think, that if you saw me on the street and you asked me, I would describe it more as being an atheist.
Right.
But
so, I think that it is fair to say that, well, I don't think that Russell is putting forward very good arguments here, that there are certain arguments which are more powerful, right, that have been presented. And as you were mentioning to me last night, that St. Thomas Aquinas, in the Summa Theologica, every problem he looks at, he always gives the opposing viewpoint first.
Oh, yeah, and they're always great.
And they are great. This to me is an example of true intellectual honesty and intellectual charity, is that Thomas never tries to straw man. There's the term steel manning. That's what he does. He tries to make the opposing argument as good as possible, and he's so good at this. It's so fair. You don't feel any of that sense of prejudice. And so when he looks early on in the Prima Pars about the question, does God exist? He begins, first of all, with the opposing viewpoint. It would seem, he writes, that God does not exist. He gives two arguments, and in their root form, they're still the two principal arguments that atheism relies upon today.
Well, and if they aren't, I would always argue with my atheistic friends or agnostic friends that if they aren't using these two arguments, they definitely should, because they're much stronger than whatever they're coming up with, to be completely honest.
Especially the second one, which is the problem of evil, which I think, for all of history is probably the single, most powerful argument against theism.
Sure.
And the fact that Thomas's logical formulation of the problem of evil is probably about the best I've ever seen. It's stronger than it's usually presented. So to me, that is an admirable example of intellectual honesty and charity.
And then the first one is that, and I'm just paraphrasing here, is that everything can be explained by
natural explanations.
By some natural means.
Exactly. So either we don't need to posit the existence of God because natural things are sufficient explanation, or that we can positively say God doesn't exist because...
Right, we know where fire comes from, the gas stove, and
So those really in various forms are still kind of the two main arguments, and Thomas puts them forward in a very convincing and powerful way. Then they do get dismantled later on, but I do think that it is good to say, to be very fair, that I don't want to caricature atheism as only the new atheists, or that some of the mistakes that Russell makes in this essay are typical of all atheists, or that atheism doesn't have some really well thought out arguments and good, challenging puzzles.
Or that Russell doesn't have
precisely
very well thought out arguments. Yeah,
that's precisely true. And like in the Copleston debate, though, I think we'd say that Copleston kind of emerges as the victor there. Russell certainly goes into much deeper than he does here, and he shows that he's a very intelligent philosopher and logician.
And much later in life. Is it 1959, I think? This is 27, that's 59.
So no doubt his thought had matured quite a bit by that point.
Well, and just thinking of his clarity of mind.
Yeah.
To be, what did they say? He was born in
1870-ish?
1872, yeah. So, for him to be almost in his 90s or something, It's
And he still speaks better than I do.
yeah, so intelligent
And
so
thinks quickly on his feet.
much quicker than I can, that's for sure.
So I think that those are some good points. And I really look forward to digging into this more with you in upcoming episodes. So, well, that's all for us for today. So thank you once again for listening to Spirit Spire. We'll be back next week with more. God bless.